Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I'm going to talk about zeroing in on compatibility. So, off the top of my head, I can think of, there's sex, there's money, there's beliefs, kids, occupation, recreation, entertainment, education, a number of things, and I will try to cover all of those. And they apply differently, I think, when, depending on if you're younger or if you're an older person. Because when you think about this, just in a overview, when you're younger and you're talking about sex, money, beliefs, kids, occupation, your recreation, entertainment, education, and so forth, there's still a lot left to learn and discover. And, younger could be, say somebody in your 20s and 30s. And when I'm talking about an older person, somebody that's probably been in a long-term relationship or married, and they could be in their 40s, 50s, and older. Younger people are still experimenting, still learning about life, learning about all the choices that are out there, and then experiencing and then deciding for themselves what is a better fit. And even having had time to live with that, to say, okay, early on, I know that there were lots of other choices. It's to be able to borrow from your own experience and use that to work the next choice, as opposed to when you're a lot older, and I will get into this, when you've done all of this, all of the experimenting that comes with learning about all the possibilities and the variables, meeting different people and having the experiences, some that work for you and some that don't. And then for those that you thought that didn't work for you, then coming back and sort of reorienting yourself to change that so that you can have a different experience with it. And again, I find that younger people have that to live through, as opposed when you're, at that older age range, when you've done all of that and you've sort of settled on what it is you like. I mean, kind of sort of gets set in your ways, so to speak. Not as though that's a bad thing, but it comes from knowing yourself a lot better. I think when you're younger, you think you know yourself, but what you know is what you know. And there is still a lot left to discover. That's the fascinating thing. And I like making those observations and having conversations with people who, they think they know it. And when you've lived life, you kind of look back on what you thought you knew and have new experiences, and you keep re-experiencing that newness. When you've lived a while, there isn't too much that really surprises you in terms of whether it's new or not. You kind of know what's out there, and you know the gimmicks. You know that something is just all about show and not about substance. I think what you're more surprised at when you're older is that things, the amount of substance that's involved. And experience in life teaches you where to look to find those sorts of things. It's like a local knowing all of the good places to go eat, as opposed to the tourists who get caught up in all the glitz and the glamour, and they just follow the touristy thing. And, there's a term called, tourist traps. It's because tourists tend to go to places that do all the great advertising, have the big showy stuff. But again, the locals, the people who have been there a while, tend to know this. And I want to put, just as a description, I'll put older people in that they've experienced it before. They tend to know what they want. And that's when it comes to compatibility now. This is, I wanted to use all of that as a setup to explain why when you're faced with a lot of options and you are newer at this sort of thing, it's why it's going to seem almost daunting. But the nice thing about it is when you're newer at this, if you're open, and this is something you have to ask yourself, if you've not experienced relationships the way someone has when they've been through a few of them, then you might see yourself as compatible with more variety. And I say that out of curiosity. So you experience different people, different cultures, and that sort of gives you an opening to say yes a lot more often. And if you had a good experience with it, then you tend to repeat this. Sometimes with the same, or maybe you'll repeat the new experience with, say, maybe a person of a different culture. And that's a good thing, because what you're trying to do now is you're trying to create a framework which establishes some of your own boundaries. And life will give you many opportunities to experience these things. Believe me, life gives you plenty of opportunities to learn the right and the wrong. And the longer you live, you just learn to file that away in your memory as to what works for you. And you look for other people who would probably do things in a similar fashion. At least at some point you do that. And for older people, that's usually down the road, and that's when they become older. Now, I'm not using older as a bad thing. I'm just really talking relative in terms of you have people who are newer at dating, newer at that experience of seeing life versus someone who's been around a while and who's seen it a number of times and then has decided for themselves what they really like because they've had a lot of experiences. Now, something that I see, and this invariably happens with somebody who is new in this, sometimes it's because of maybe a tradition that a younger person may have come up with, that tradition of doing things a specific way. And I like to tell people, be open to possibility, because you don't know what you don't know. And when you stay open to possibility, new experiences and different people, different kinds of events, then what you have is you develop this flexibility, this malleability, which says when something comes your way, you'll try it out. Or if something comes your way, you develop an intuition about, that's not such a good thing, and that's not safe. You stay away from it. Whether it's a person, whether it's a thing, whether it's an activity. You tend to learn your limits and boundaries, and you build on this. So you have all of this information coming at you, and it could be on a daily basis. But the fact that when you're trying to zero in on compatibility, now I'm going to tie this together when it has to do with bringing other people into your life, you have a basis for having conversation about your experiences and finding out about the other person. And this is why you have to live your life, take stock in the things that you do, what matters, and you hang on to that. So as you move forward in your experience of life, you look for people that do things, say, maybe similar. And you bond with them, you have fun with them, and maybe they introduce you to other parts of themselves that you might find interesting and exciting. Because remember that part I said a little while ago about people doing things out of tradition. And some people are very staunch about that. And, religion is one of those things. And I talked about that in the way of spirituality. So I'm going to cover this after I come back from this commercial break. So please stay tuned.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And we're back. This is John Johnson, the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I'm talking about zeroing in on compatibility. Now, where I left off, and I started to talk about spirituality. So here's an experience I had. I mean, as a younger person, I was a keyboard player in a band, and obviously, being the young person that I was, I didn't really make any decisions about where this band played, but I played in what would be called, a contemporary gospel group. So, because I didn't really book any of the shows, I just basically went wherever the band had to perform, just to be sure that I wanted to hold my spot in the band. We'd rehearse and then we go perform. Now I got to see lots of different churches, lots of different denominations. Various people would show up, and we'd get our acknowledgments for having been had a great performance. But the experience that I got out of that was one of being able to appreciate lots of different people, and there really wasn't, say, a big church service per se, because it was more or less geared towards the performance. It was like, say, having a concert. But the fact that the people were always so nice, and it didn't matter what church I went to. So it didn't really get caught up in that they didn't belong to the church that I went to. And I learned from other people about their experience of growing up, was that they were taught that their religion was the religion. And if you didn't belong to, their spiritual denomination, then you weren't as good as. And believe it or not, some people are brought up that way. It's a basis for, kind of, I think, making people not see other religions as being okay. So I'm using that as a setup to help you understand where being a little more flexible on that gave me an opportunity to really appreciate different faiths. That by doing so also allowed me to see the value in other people and the contribution that they could make. Therefore, if you would happen to meet someone who is, say, of a different, say, spiritual background, and giving value to that experience, maybe they might want you to go to their place of worship. And if you're comfortable enough and you're open to that, you might have the experience of, wow, these are really nice people, and it doesn't matter where you go, just as long as they all believe in treating people well, treating people right, fair and honesty, those kinds of values. I think those core values are what we really look at when we determine that another person is somebody that we want to spend our time with. And being younger and being flexible about that, not being dogmatic, but being flexible about that, really allowed me the opportunity to meet lots and lots and lots of different people, different cultures, definitely various backgrounds. And I was also not seen as a person who was going to put my beliefs on someone else. So I was widely accepted. And I found that to be very helpful, because as I got older, my relationship with people Well, I put it this way. There were lots of people that I could consider my family. And I was able to do this out of love and acceptance. And if there came a time, because of my experience in life, but if there ever came a time where there was disagreement, there was a way in which, having had experience in life where you can discuss these things and talk about them and it not be a big deal. Because one of the things that I've always appreciated about someone who was really, say, well-versed in their own spirituality was their ability to explain it to me in a way that I could grasp it. Because I'm not anybody's expert in that idea, but I am a very good listener. So why do I bring that up? I bring that up to say that if you are open, you're new at all of this and the relationships and the experiences that can be had, when you're open, then there's lots that'll come your way that can help shape your perception of things. And the people that you might be compatible with, it could be a lot more broad. And then you learn what questions to ask of people. You don't have to just be the know-it-all. You become somebody who's more interesting because you're asking questions. Now, if you have moved along in life and you're a little older, then a lot of these things have already happened for you, even if just by happenstance. And you lived a life where you've been open to observation and change and conversation, and you've educated yourself as to what's going on in the world. Then you've already had a lot of these experiences, and then you sort of pare down and know what limits or where your boundaries are, and how you can have conversations and discussions around these sorts of things. So it's not like you're always being led, but you know what it feels like to have a stake in something and to be able to express that because you've experienced it. So the compatibility part is this. When you find people who are very similar in beliefs. So you can be someone who likes it a very specific way and you look for someone who meets that, or you can be someone who is really flexible and you like someone that also exhibits that flexibility. Remember, this is all about how you've experienced things and now being able to be fully self-expressed about that. You know what you are looking for. So here's the compatibility part. And, having just described what works for you, you take that and you build on it in every respect. So, I was talking about spirituality in this regard. The occupation, there's blue collar and there's white collar. And obviously certain things appeal to you because of an occupation. I know a lot of people, that is a big factor in who they're attracted to. And for some, it's because of the money factor. A lot of people perceive white collar jobs as being jobs that are much more highly skilled, a lot more pay, and generally when there's a lot more education involved, it's more specialized. Yes, you can reasonably expect that a certain job of that nature is going to pay a lot more. But what we find oftentimes we put in the blue collar category is people who are subcontractors, who have their own businesses, oftentimes do quite well. It just does not. It's not something that necessarily shows up on the radar because we tend to attach a lot of status to people that have gone to college and have degrees, but that's not something that fits everyone's type. So, again, thinking about this in a much more broad term, when you've had experience with relationships, and let's say we look at this from the standpoint of not so much the money aspect. Let's say there are a lot of places in the world where blue collar and white collar, let's say just for an illustration, make the same. What's going to be the deciding factor for you? It probably has to do with how do they treat you? What are their manners like? Are they arrogant? And you can have those in either camp, blue or white collar, it doesn't matter. But it's really about the individual and not so much about the status that you attach to one over the other. Because in the way we speak of it oftentimes, we talk about white collar as if it's better than blue collar. So I'm going to take a break. I will come right back after this. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm John Johnson, talking about zeroing in on compatibility. Now, when I first opened the show, I gave a number of topics that I was going to try to cover in the length of this program. So money was one of those that I talked about. And this is one of those tricky subjects. When we talk about money, a lot of people say, well, any amount's a good amount. The more the better. And it's not so much about the size of your bank account. It's the value you place on money in terms of, okay, is money king in your house? Is it something that is it a tool that you use to take care of business, or is it what rules you? And when it comes to compatibility, that's what we really need to look at. Now, if you're somebody that understands what the value of money is, and I put value in terms of, and I'm going to use a very simple explanation for this thing, because it can be very, very complex. The value of money. Some people spend everything they get their hands on, and that's just the way they're wired. They want things. They go out and they earn the money, but they spend it. So I'm not even talking about somebody who would steal it. I'm just talking about some people know how to save and some don't. And if you're a person who grew up understanding that saving is important, not spending everything you make, but, it's okay to have a good time, but learning how to save. There are a lot of people who do not understand that value. They don't experience that. So, and here's where I have learned something about that. I've been self-sufficient on my own for years and years and years. So somebody who hasn't had the kind of responsibility that I've had probably doesn't have the experience to understand how important it is to save for a rainy day, so to speak. Now, some people do. And if you are matched up with someone that does not have the same value about money, that is going to be a source of friction, because money is a tool. You pay your bills with it. You buy your groceries. You buy the car. You handle a lot of business in life because of your money. And if you don't have enough of it, there are things that you are going to be doing without. And you have to save for certain things. The bigger things you have to save for, a car, appliances, things like that. Some people have to save for groceries. But whatever it is, you want somebody who has a similar belief. Because if you are paired with that person, you are coupled with that individual, and they don't have a similar value in terms of one saves, the other one doesn't, well, then you're going to find yourself kind of doing this really weird dance, and you're going to struggle. Whereas if you had two people that knew how to save, then you can make a plan for something and know that it's going to happen. Or if, and here's something that happens. So, if you hit a rough patch, knowing that you have someone who is in it with you is going to be a lot more comfortable than knowing that you have somebody who is a little reckless with their finances. That's something that you really want to dial in quickly. I have a dear friend, and she meant the world to me. And she had this guy that she was head over heels for. And when she described this person to me, now I don't make it my business to tell anyone who they can or cannot date. That is not my deal. I've never done that. I've only tried to ask critical thinking questions to say, hey, consider this. So you know where I'm going with this story. She hooked herself up with this guy who she felt she was head over heels for, and he knew she had a lot of money. She was a professional. She made lots of money. There was just money floating around in the family. But I mean, he discovered that a little later on in the relationship, not very long after they started dating, but a little while. But I remember vividly in the beginning, she's saying to me she didn't want to tell him a lot about herself in terms of the finances, because since she was fairly well-to-do, her concern was that she would just get used for the money. Well, guess what happened? Yes, she got used for a lot of cash. And my point to her in the very beginning was, I said, look, if you have reservations about telling this guy about those kinds of things, then maybe this isn't a good relationship for you. But she got herself hooked. And after some time later and lots of money later, she came and shared with me, the dilemma. She was in love with the guy, but she didn't know how to cut him off. And if you can imagine the situation as it, just drug on and on and on and on. And I can't tell you to this day what the status of that situation is, because I can only imagine that it didn't get any better. And now I say that knowing that, you love who you love. That's just how it comes about. But you got to be careful who you love, because when these kinds of things begin to surface, you see how they can kind of flash back on you. And as it is with my friend, she obviously got to a place where she didn't feel like she could get herself out of it. And it just became more and more expensive for her. Like I said, I don't really know the outcome of the situation at this moment, because I'm not the kind of person that's going to say I told you so, but I can imagine that it didn't go really well. Now, that, again, is a reference to newer, younger couples, whereas if you're a little older, you've kind of established yourself as being, you've established your boundaries on how those things work, and you probably have older kids. So that's not something you're going to go back on. But if you have, let's say, a newer relationship, let's say you're older and you're meeting somebody who's already had kids, or there's going to be the blended family kind of thing, then you're going to have these very same conversations about the money, about the sex, about the child rearing, so that you can be on the same page, because that's going to have a big impact on the peace being in the house. So something I want to cover very quickly while I have the time. So if all the other parts of the relationship works, what can you do to bridge this difference if somebody wants to go out and take in a part of nature and be with walks and things like that? When you have all the other elements of the relationship that work, well, then you can find a group that you can do the nature walk with, because that's not going to upset the integrity in the relationship. And you can find ways like that to bridge the differences. Look, my time is just about up. This is John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.